Hi guys, I am coming to you from the library. Today we are going to read Chapter 3 of Great Gatsby. Before we begin, I want to kind of recap Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we were introduced to Tom Buchanan's mistress, Myrtle Wilson. She lives in the Valley of the Ashes. The Valley of Ashes is what we would call a juxtaposition to East and West Egg. In the Valley of Ashes, we see desolation, we see poverty, we see the eyes of Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg, and some would say that those symbolize the eyes of God looking down and frowning at what the 1920s has become. They also represent just the moral decay and the facade and just the fakeness of what is in East and West Egg. I want us to go ahead and get into Chapter 3. In Chapter 3, we are actually introduced to J. Gatsby. All right, so I am on page 39. Please follow along as I read. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne of the stars. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft or taking the sun on the hot sand of his beach, while his two motorboat slits the water of the Sound, drawing aquaplanes over cataracts of foam. On weekends, his Rolls-Royce becomes an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while his station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. And on Mondays, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops and scrubbing brushes and hammers and garden shears, repairing the ravages of the nights before. Every Friday, 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from a fruitier in New York. Every Monday, these same oranges and lemons left his back door and a pyramid of pulpless halves. There was a machine in the kitchen which could extract the juice of 200 oranges in half an hour if a little button was pressed 200 times by a butler's thumb. At least once a fortnight, a corps of caterers came down with several hundred feet of canvas and enough colored lights to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's enormous garden. On buffet tables garnished with glistening hors d'oeuvres, spiced baked hams, crowded against salads of harlequin designs, and pastry pigs and turkeys bewitched to a dark gold. In the main hall, a bar with a real brass rail was set up, and stocked with gins and liquors, with cordials so long forgotten that most of his female guests were too young to know one from another. All right, guys, so I want you to pay attention as we're reading to how Gatsby's parties are described. In just a little bit of time, we are going to be comparing the party held at the Buchanans, then the one at Tom and Myrtle's apartment in the city, and then finally J. Gatsby's party. By 7 o'clock, the orchestra has arrived. No thin 5-piece affair, but a whole pitful of oboes and trombones and saxophones and violas and cornets and piccolos and low and high drums. The last swimmers have come in from the beach now and are dressing upstairs. The cars from New York are parked 5 deep in the drive, and already the halls and salons and verandas are gaudy with primary colors, and hair shorn in strange new ways and shawls beyond the dreams of Castile. The bar is in full swing, and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside until the air is alive with clutter and laughter and casual innuendo and introductions forgotten on the spot, and enthusiastic meetings between women who never knew each other's names. The lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera of voices pitches a key higher. Laughter is easier minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, tipped out a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly, swell with new arrivals, dissolve, and form in the same breath. Already there are wanderers, confident girls who weave here and there among the stouter and more stable, become for a sharp, joyous moment the center of the group, and then, excited with triumph, glide on through a sea of change of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. Suddenly, one of these gypsies in trembling opal seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and moves her hands like Frisco, dances out alone on the canvas platform, a momentary hush. The orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligingly for her, and there is a burst of chatter as the enormous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun. I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited. They went there. They got into automobiles which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. Once there, they were introduced by somebody who knew Gatsby, and after that they conducted themselves according to the rules of behavior associated with an amusement park. So they kind of acted a fool, y'all. They didn't care. They didn't know who Gatsby was. They were just going to some wild party where alcohol and food was free. Sometimes they came and went without having met Gatsby at all, came for the party with a simplicity of heart that was its own ticket of admission. I had actually been invited. A chauffeur in a uniform of robin's egg blue crossed my lawn early that Saturday morning with a surprisingly formal note from his employer. The honor would be entirely Gatsby's, it said, if I would attend his little party that night. He had seen me several times and had intended to call on me long before, but a peculiar combination of circumstances had prevented it. Signed, J. Gatsby, in his majestic hand. Dressed up in white flannels, I went over to his lawn a little after 7 and wandered around rather ill at ease among swirls of eddies of people I didn't know. Though here and there was a face I had noticed on the commuting train, I was immediately struck by the number of young Englishmen dotted about, all well dressed, all looking a little hungry, and all taking in low, earnest voices to solid and prosperous Americans. Okay, guys, why might there be English people there? I was sure that they were selling something, bonds or insurance or automobiles. They were at least agonizingly aware of the easy money in the vicinity, and convinced it was theirs for a few words in the right key. As soon as I arrived, I made an attempt to find my host, but the 2 or 3 people of whom I asked his whereabouts stared at me in such an amazed way, and denied so vehemently any knowledge of his movements, that I slunk off in the direction of the cocktail table, the only place in the garden where a single man could linger without looking purposeless and alone. I was on my way to get roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when Jordan Baker came out of the house and stood at the head of the marble steps, leaning a little backward and looking with contemptuous interest down into the garden. Welcome or not, I found it necessary to attach myself to someone before I should begin to address cordial remarks to passer-by. "Hello!" I roared, advancing toward her. My voice seemed unnaturally loud across the garden. "I thought you might be here," she responded absently as I came up. "I remembered you lived next door to—" She held my hand impersonally, as a promise that she'd take care of me in a minute, and gave her ear to 2 girls in twin yellow dresses, who stopped at the foot of the steps. "Hello!" they cried together. "Sorry you didn't win." That was for the golf tournament she had lost in the finals the weeks before. "You don't know who we are," said one of the girls in yellow, "but we met you here about a month ago." "You've dyed your hair since then," remarked Jordan. And I started, but the girls had moved casually on, and her remark was addressed to the premature moon, produced, like the supper, no doubt out of a caterer's basket. With Jordan's slender golden arm resting in mine, we descended the steps and sauntered about the garden. A tray of cocktails floated at us through the twilight, and we sat down at a table with 2 girls in yellow and 3 men, each one introduced to us as Mr. Mumble. "Do you come to these parties often?" inquired Jordan of the girl beside her. "The last one was the one I met you at," answered the girl in an alert, confident voice. She turned to her companion. "Wasn't it for you, Lucille?" "It was for Lucille, too." I like to come, Lucille said. I never care what I do, so I always have a good time. When I was here last, I tore my gown on a chair, and he asked me my name and address. Inside of a week, I got a package from Courier's with a new evening gown in it. Did you keep it? Asked Jordan. Sure I did. I was going to wear it tonight, but it was too big in the bust and had to be altered. It was gas blue with lavender beads, $265. There's something funny about a fellow that'll do a thing like that, said the other girl eagerly. He doesn't want any trouble with anybody. Who doesn't? I inquired. Gatsby, somebody told me. The two girls and Jordan leaned together confidently. Somebody told me they thought he killed a man once. A thrill passed over all of us. The three Mr. Mumbles bent forward and listened eagerly. I don't think it's so much that, argued Lucille skeptically. It's more that he was a German spy during the war. One of the men nodded in confirmation. I heard that from a man who knew all about him. Grew up with him in Germany, he assured us positively. Oh, no, said the first girl. It couldn't be that, because he was in the American Army during the war. As our credulity switched back and forth, she leaned forward with enthusiasm. You look at him sometimes when he thinks nobody's looking at him. I'll bet he killed a man. All right, guys, so no one knows Gatsby. Many of these people have been to his party before, but the man is aloof. They have no idea who he is or really how he got his money. She narrowed her eyes and shivered. Lucille shivered. We all turned and looked around for Gatsby. It was testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired that there were whispers about him from those who had found little that it was necessary to whisper about it in the world. The first supper, there would be another one after midnight, was now being served, and Jordan invited me to join her own party, who were spread around the table on the other side of the garden. There were 3 married couples and Jordan's escort, a persistent undergraduate given to violent innuendo, and obviously under the impression that sooner or later Jordan was going to yield him up her person to a greater or lesser degree. Instead of rambling, this party had preserved a dignified homogeneity and assumed to itself the function of representing the staid nobility of the countryside, East Egg condescending to West Egg, and carefully on guard against its spectroscopic gaiety. Let's get out, whispered Jordan after a somehow wasteful and inappropriate half-hour. This is much too polite for me. We got up, and she explained that we were going to find the host. I had never met him, she said, and it was making me uneasy. The undergraduate nodded in a cynical, melancholy way. The bar, where we glanced first, was crowded, but Gatsby was not there. She couldn't find him from the top of the steps, and he wasn't on the veranda. On a chance, we tried an important-looking door and walked into a Gothic library, paneled with carved English oak, and probably transported complete from some ruin overseas. All right, guys, so Jordan and Nick have found their way into Gatsby's library. A stout, middle-aged man with enormous owl eyes, spectacles, was sitting somewhat drunk on the edge of a great table, staring with unsteady concentration at the shelves of books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. "What do you think?" he demanded impetuously. "About what?" He waved his hand toward the bookshelves. "About that! As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain." "I ascertained. They're real." "The books?" He nodded. "Absolutely real. Have pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice, durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages and here, let me show you." Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with Volume 1 of the Stoddard Lectures. "See?" he cried triumphantly. "It's a bona fide piece of printed matter. It fooled me. This fellow's a regular Belasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness, what realism. Knew when to stop to. Didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect?" He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. So, owl eyes is surprised to find that there are real books in Gatsby's library. Okay? They're real. They're not empty cardboard cutouts. They're not designed to look like a library. This suggests that really many of the inhabitants of both East and West Egg are all about show, the outwardness of looking educated, of looking the part, the show of opulence, the driving of the big cars, and all of that. However, what is suggested is that underneath there's inner corruption and moral decay, and we really saw that come to fruition with the Valley of Ashes. So that is why Allies is so surprised that this isn't just a show, that these are indeed real books, and this is Gatsby's library. He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on the shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. "Who brought you?" he demanded. "Or did you just come?" "I was brought. Most people were brought." Jordan looked at me alertly, cheerfully, without answering. "I was brought by a woman named Roosevelt," he continued. "Mrs. Claude Roosevelt. Do you know her? I met her somewhere last night. I've been drunk for about a week now, and I thought it might sober me up to sit in the library." "Has it?" "A little bit, I think. I can't tell yet. I've only been here an hour." "Did I tell you about the books? They're real. You told us." We shook hands with him gravely and went back outdoors. There was dancing now on the canvas in the gardens, old men pushing young girls backward to eternal graceless circles, superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping the corners, and a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. A celebrated tenor had sung in Italian, and a notorious contralto had sung in jazz, and between the numbers, people were doing stunts all over the garden, while happy vacuous bursts of laughter rose toward the summer sky. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the girls in yellow, did a baby act in costume, and champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. The moon had risen higher, and floating in the sound was a triangle of silver scales, trembling a little to the stiff, tiny drip of the banjos on the lawn. I was still with Jordan Baker. We were sitting at a table with a man of about my age and a rowdy little girl, who gave way upon the slightest provocation to uncontrollable laughter. I was enjoying myself now. I had taken 2 finger bowls of champagne, and the scene had changed before my eyes into something significant, elemental, and profound. At a lull in the entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. "Your face looks familiar," he said politely. "Weren't you in the 3rd Division during the war?" "Why, yes. I was in the 9th Machine Gun Battalion." "I was in the 7th Infantry until June 1918. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before." We talked for a moment about some wet, gray little village in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. "Want to go with me, old sport? Just near the shore along the Sound." "What time?" "Any time that suits you best." I was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. "Having a gay time now?" she inquired. "Much better." I turned again to my new acquaintance. "This is an unusual party for me. I haven't seen the host. I live over there." I waved my hand at an invisible hedge in the distance. "And this man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation." For a moment, he looked at me as if he failed to understand me. "I'm Gatsby," he said suddenly. "What?" I exclaimed. "Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host." He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced or seemed to face the whole external world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irreversible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that at your best you hoped to convey. All right, that is the first impression that Nick had of Gatsby. So I need for you to remember that, because we're going to go and talk about it towards the end of the chapter. Precisely at that point, it vanished. Okay, so now we're back in reality. This is the real Gatsby. And I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. Sometime before he introduced himself, I got a strong impression that he was picking his words with care. Okay, so a roughneck. Should he be here? Where is he really from? Why is he picking his words carefully? Almost at that moment, when Mr. Gatsby identified himself, a butler hurried toward him with the information that Chicago was calling him on the wire. He excused himself with a small bow that included each of us in turn. "If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport," he urged me. "Excuse me, I will rejoin you later." Why old sport? Why do you think he feels the need to call everybody old sport? When he was gone, I turned immediately to Jordan, constrained to assure her of my surprise. I had expected that Mr. Gatsby would be a florid and corpulent person in his middle years. Okay, so Nick would assume that Gatsby would be this old guy in his middle years. "Who is he?" I demanded. "Do you know?" "He's just a man named Gatsby." "Where is he from, I mean? And what does he do?" "Now you're started on the subject," she answered with a wan smile. "Well, he told me he was an Oxford man." A dim background started to take shape behind him, but at her next remark it faded away. "However, I don't believe it." "Why not?" "I don't know," she insisted. "I just don't think he went there." Something in her tone reminded me of the other girls. I think he killed a man, and had the effect of stimulating my curiosity. I would have to accept, without question, the information that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana, or from the Lower East Side of New York. That was comprehensible, but young men didn't, at least in my provincial inexperience. I believe they didn't drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a place on Long Island Sound. All right, guys, so we got a little bit of foreshadowing here. That is Gatsby, who he really says he is. Nick says, hey, he looks like the kind of guy that could have come out of a Louisiana swamp or the Lower East Side, but how on earth did this man end up here? Like, this just does not happen. Anyhow, he gives large parties, said Jordan, changing the subject with an urban distaste for the concrete. And I like parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy. All right, guys, so I want you to think about that. Are large parties more intimate? Can we sneak away? Can we be someone different? When we are forced to accompany a smaller party, we're watched. There was a boom of the bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the garden. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried at the request of Mr. Gatsby, "we are going to play for you Mr. Vladimir Tostof's latest work, which attracted so much attention at Carnegie Hall last May. If you read the papers, you know there was a big sensation." He smiled with jovial condescension and added, "some sensation," whereupon everyone laughed. "The piece is known," he concluded lustily, "as Vladimir Tostof's Jazz History of the World." The nature of Mr. Tostof's composition eluded me, because just as it began, my eyes fell on Gatsby standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with approving eyes. His tan skin was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. I could see nothing sinister about him. I wondered if the fact that he was not drinking helped to set off from his guests, For it seemed to me that he grew more correct as the fraternal hilarity increased. Okay, guys, so notice that Gatsby is not drinking. Why might this be? Why is he not having fun and partying with all of his other guests? When the jazz history of the world was over, girls were putting their heads on men's shoulders in a puppyish, convivial way. Girls were swooning backward, playful into men's arms, even into groups, knowing that someone would arrest their falls. But no one swooned backward on Gatsby, and no French bob touched Gatsby's shoulder, and no singing quarters were formed with Gatsby's head for one link. "I beg your pardon." Gatsby's butler was suddenly standing beside us. "Miss Baker?" he inquired. "I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone." "With me?" she exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, madam." She got up slowly, raising her eyebrows at me in astonishment, and followed the butler toward the house. I noticed that she wore her evening dress, all her dresses, like sports clothes. There was a jauntiness about her movements, as if she had first learned to walk upon a golf course on clean, crisp mornings.